Good afternoon. It is a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Sarah Quesada and our guests to her lecture, Nasserism, Global Mexico, and the Birth of a Latin African Politics. Sarah M. Quesada is an Associate Professor of Romance Studies and of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University. She is the author of The African Heritage of Latinx and Caribbean Literature from Cambridge University Press in 2022. The book received an honorable mention for first book in 2023 from the Modern Languages Association. Her work has also appeared in the leading journals like PMLA, Comparative Literature, African Studies Review, among other places. Her research focuses on the Global South, or South-South engagements, between US, Latinx, Latin American, and African literatures, mainly regarding histories of slavery, internationalism, and decolonization. Quesada is also working on a monograph that investigates different Cold War attachments between intellectuals in Greater Mexico and Africa, while unburying influences of lesser-known feminists in the Global South. Her work has been supported by the National Humanities Center, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, among other places, and she is currently the book review editor for the Cambridge Journal of Postcolonial Literary Inquiry. Please join me in welcoming her.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It is such an honor to be here with you today. I'm just delighted to be presenting on a new project. It's a new project, almost finalized, and it's wonderful to be presenting it here at the American University of Cairo. And of course, I want to thank Tahia and Steve for the lovely invitation. I've been admiring your work for a long time, so it is a real treat and a delight to be in dialogue with you today, and with all of you in the audience as well. Thank you all for being here. I always want to say this. I am Mexican, so I always say, okay, well, at least I have Claudia Sheinbaum to lean on, but I do want to apologize for our terrible government in the United States. It's shameful, and I always want to say that up front. And it's been such an honor to be traveling in your beautiful country. I'm in awe of being in the center of human civilization. We've traveled with my family from Aswan to Luxor through up the Nile, and it's just been a dream. It's really grand. It's been such an honor. So thank you for having me today. As you can probably tell, like Tahia, I am a comparatist scholar working on South-South solidarities. And so today I'm going to be speaking for about 40 minutes on this first chapter that I've written about on the engagement between African and Greater Mexican intellectuals of the Cold War period. And by Greater Mexican, I mean not only Mexicans, but also Mexican Americans in the U.S. Mexican Americans. This was an unprecedented relationship. It was a hopeful one. It was ultimately also described in contemporary literature, like the one that you see here. You see that? Oh, yes. As a ultimately failed relationship. These are a lot of the novels that you see here are novels that are set in Latin America that describe the Latin American-African relationship that has failed. And some of these African novels set in Latin America depict a relationship that's failed because, on the one hand, of course, Global South revolutionary failure that led to many times to authoritarian regimes, but also the mistrust that existed between Global South partnerships during this Third World Revolution. And that is that African revolutionaries, for example, harbored this deep mistrust towards white Latin American partners because of the latter's overgeneralizations of African peoples, sometimes orientalizations, as Tahia has described in her work. This attitude demonstrated, of course, a lack of cultural knowledge of Africa in the very spaces that Latin Americans were supposed to support. And this absence of cultural understanding and the presence of desired solidarity beckons the following question. If an ally of the Global South is issuing comparative generalizations or orientalizations of another member of the Global South, Is it still solidarity? As it turns out, scattered archives, excuse me for screaming, it's a microphone. I'm very bad at microphones, so please tell me if I'm like, because I'm kind of deaf too, so if I'm like really like hurting your ears, please let me know and I will back off. But in scattered archives across the globe for many years that I've been looking at revealed that it was precisely this complicated backdrop that produced one of the most foundational strategies of South-South cooperation that the world has ever known. The Mexican archive, for example, reveals a strategy which I coin similarity and difference, or difference and similarity. Go back and forth between these two sort of descriptions. It's a strategy that we find none other in Egypt's first prime minister, Gamal Abdel Nasser. So what I will argue today is that Nasser's proposed a fascinating model that assumed differences in solidarity. And what he advocated was a kind of what we might call a liminal leftism that was undefined as a category during the Cold War period in which it was being executed. So it was kind of, we couldn't really grasp the sort of the strategy behind it because it felt neither on the left nor on the right. Meanwhile, attention turned away from Nasser once the showman Fidel Castro began captivating audiences after the Cuban Revolution. And this is when Nasserism became, I argue, somewhat dissolved into Cuban internationalism. And to this day, post-colonial and decolonial studies have been unable to rise to the challenge to parse out the difference between Cuban internationalism and Nasserism. And of course, Nasser's strategic model of solidarity. And because we've been failing to name this, it's as if terms in decolonial studies have become exhausted to name what Nasser is doing in the face of state-sponsored genocide and the erosion of international law that we're witnessing today. But from our vantage point in the present, I think a critical return to Nasser's and other models I explore in this book could pave the way to both name and resurrect the strategies for banding together in the fight for justice, of course, in the present, and then through the literatures that Nasser, I argue, inspired. And after all, Nasser's ethos lives on in literature of, for example, Mexican Nobel laureate and poet Octavio Paz, but also the first ambassador to Egypt, Alejandro Carrillo, in his memoirs. And I'm mostly going to be talking about gentlemen on the right and Carrillo, although the first chapter is on Octavio. The second chapter that I read about is Octavio Paz and what we find about his Nasserism in the archives, but also in his books. Some of them, when they're translated, actually not included his mentions of Nasser when they've been translated. So that's interesting. We can talk about it more during the Q&A. But both of these gentlemen shed a different kind of light on Nasser's politics. It's an unprecedented union of African and Latin American politics that Nasser championed. This transatlantic realpolitik gave way to what I have termed in my first book that Tahia mentioned, The African Heritage of Latinx and Caribbean Literature. I talk about Gabriel Garcia Marquez and the ways in which the Angolan civil war that Cubans helped sponsor, actually originated this, what we might call a Latin African literature. So today I want to revisit the origin story of Latin African literature, which begins actually with, Nasser. It takes place actually both in Egypt and Mexico, and I'll explain why. In many ways, this book is a correction, actually, of my first book already. It was only published in 2023, and already I'm correcting things. But in that book, I had claimed that Latin African literature originated with somebody like Fidel Castro because of this rhetoric of Latin African solidarity in 1960 when he was invited to the UN National Assembly in New York. For example, he would mention things, I'm not really sure how to explain this. It's in Spanish, but I can sort of translate and paraphrase bits of it.
Y para los revolucionarios cubanos, el campo de batalla contra el imperialismo abarca a todo el mundo. Sin alardes, sin
that single enemy, we are ready to die on the behalf of all of those of our allies. So it's very much like this rhetoric of similarity, that there's no difference, that we're all in the sort of a similar boat. And it has its merit, of course. It's trying to bring solidarity together. But that's sort of the general gist of his rhetoric, and it'll continue to be his rhetoric during this revolutionary time period. And he continues doing this when he gives this speech when he's about to, when he figures that they have, that the Cuban state has gained some ground in the Angolan Civil War, and he says these really what I thought was sort of key terminology to his mission. He said he was addressing Caviana's first Congress, and he termed Cuba a Latin African country. And so that terminology is what I ran with in my first book, is sort of the thinking about the politics of this Latin African solidarity movement on a public stage, right? And this is the UN, and then of course addressing the Cuban state, and it was a term that then the media would report on, the New York Times, etc. So this led canonical figures like Garcia Marquez to write about the Angolan War. He not only traveled to Angola, I write about this in my first book, but he traveled to Angola, reported on the mission because Fidel Castro was a friend of his and he invited him to go. He goes and surveys what the Cuban Revolution is doing on the ground, comes back, reports on it, and a lot of Garcia Marquez's chronicles of African decolonization have actually not been translated, despite the fact that Garcia Marquez is this canonical figure. Now these reports on Angola have been translated into English because they exist in a book, I think, it's actually translated in this one book here that you see. But in any case, when Garcia Marquez travels to Angola, he had been writing Chronicle de la Fortuna that Noel Tehia has also written about. And what I argue in my book is that it had taken him 30 years to write this novel, and he didn't finish it until he came back from Angola, providing sort of the missing pieces, he says in interviews, to be able to finalize the book. But this was never sort of discussed. The Angolan sort of piece of the puzzle was never discussed in criticism on an author, because in Latin American studies, Tehia has consistently written about, there has always been a disconnect between Arab and African studies and Latin American studies due to language barriers, etc. So this is what I'm trying to correct, is that it was actually, it did not start with Fidel Castro's rhetoric, that there was a floodgate that opened to Latin African studies, certainly with Garcia Marquez, that would continue on in sort of this renaissance of Latin American settings in the African novel. All of these African novels that you see here are actually in French and also in French studies. But the origin of this Latin African literature did not start with Castro. It actually started earlier, as it turns out. It was coined not by larger-than-life Castro, but Nasser was the architect of a Latin African politics. And so this story begins roughly around, actually this chart's probably better, this story begins roughly around 1955. And I don't have to really kind of go into detail with this audience about sort of the timeline of Nasser and how he comes into the Third World fold and how he becomes sort of the leader and sort of the figurehead of the Third World Revolution. But in essence, it starts in 1955 with the emergence of the non-aligned movement, then follows into the Suez nationalization of 1956, culminating in 1960 when Nasser meets Fidel Castro at the UN Assembly in Harlem, New York. And so between 1956 and 1960, there will actually be a flood of excitement for Nasserism in Latin America. Many historians have written on this. Unfortunately, the excitement will be characterized in Latin American media as a sort of a masculinist bravado aligned with Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, which is not what Nasser was really about. So, and I'll talk about this. The problem with this characterization of Nasserism is that Cuban internationalism was again not the model that Nasser proposed. But secondly, these men, Castro and Che, fell into Orientalisms of Africa that Nasser chiefly tried to disabuse, to correct. These mischaracterizations in Latin America would be taken advantage of by none other than the big brother organization of the Congress of Cultural Freedom. You've probably heard about this organization. If you haven't, I will introduce you to it. But that began, it's a Congress, a CIA-funded Congress that began its distortion campaign of Nasser in the U.S.'s neighbor to the south. And it did so through the journal Cuadernos, notebook in Spanish and English, the journal Cuadernos. And so I've researched in the archives of the Congress of Cultural Freedom, the University of Chicago, they have some in Oxford, to sort of reveal this terrible communication this incredible communication network that existed in that details, and now I'm doing the Fidel Castro thing here, that details the ways in which there was all this strategy to really distort Nasserism. And when you see it written in these documents and these correspondence, you can't, it feels like fiction. And of course the problem is that it's not. So however, despite Cuban internationalism and Western distortion, because I think there's also Cuban international distortion that plays a role here, Mexican sources tell a very different story. First, Mexican diplomatic sources in Spanish reveal that Nasser's Suez takeover was inspired actually by the 1910 Mexican Revolution. I'll explain. Which is why I say that the Latin African origin story also happened simultaneously in Mexico and Egypt. Second, Mexican sources show how despite the distortion of Western archives and leftism internationalism, Nasser created a strategic leftism that lives on in Mexican literature. So I'll begin from the beginning of this chart with, of course, the non-alignment. Non-alignment, we know this audience knows this, that was the brainchild of Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who coined the term in 1949. The idea was to become independent from the powerful blocs, the Soviets and also the West. Now really came to be shaped when Nehru met with Nasser and Joseph Tito, former Yugoslavia, of course, between 1953 and 1954. And then the term non-alignment gave way to a sense of cooperation with Third World, but leaders differed on cooperation with whom. And so for Nehru, non-alignment was strictly not with the blocs, whereas for Nasser, he held strategic openness with Soviets and later with Americans. And the reason that Nasser justified this strategic association was really telling of his solidarity and difference model. He said, when Nasser took possession of the Suez Canal, he emerged as this, and I'll explain, he emerged as the face of third world solidarity with Soviets, blessing, angering, or bothering somewhat Nehru. This because Nasser had agreed with India just a few months earlier, abandoning not to accept Soviet aid. But when circumstances changed, which forced Nasser to change his mind, that was the US refused aid, of course, to fund the Aswan Dam project that would have boosted Egypt's sovereignty. Nasser had to explain to Nehru his difficult decision with a hard truth. And he said that while India and Egypt were not aligned, they were also not the same country and had different needs. Explained to him that those were that India, for example, had a highly diversified agriculture, while Egypt mostly depended at the time on the seafood export. And so he went into sort of these explanations to Nehru onto why he had done why he did what he did. Nasser's difference and similarity principle promoted him as a figurehead of global noun, while that of Nehru faded purposes diplomatic documents. And I'll always read the original in Spanish, but you always have the translation on the slide. He says, su prestigio, o sea, de India, como líder de los países africanos y asiáticos recientemente independizados, no es ya tan incontestable. This is what I find actually in a. I told Tahia about my travails to find this document. Because of lack of time, I promised to tell you the story during the Q&A if you're interested, but it was to procure this book caused my husband a great heart attack. So I'll explain later. But it's not a book that widely circulates, and this is a book actually where Octavio Paz mentions Nasser the most. It is hidden in the Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores bookstore with odd hours. Very inconvenient. But anyways, I found it. I have it. I'm very happy. So anyways, so after Nasser's bold move with Suez and the failure of the tripartite aggression, there will be a flood of excitement for Nasser, as I mentioned, in Latin America, which means that heads of state from like Perón to the president of Brazil at the time welcomed Nasserism openly, even making visits to the Cairo, state visits. Famously, Argentine President Juan Perón considered Egypt a sister nation that had very much in common with Argentina. And this is by Cites Moore, a historian. When Nasser emerges triumphant from the Suez crisis, quote, there were marches and demonstrations in support of Egypt from Panama to the Southern Cone, says Lily Balafet. And she also says that in Argentine press, like Mundo Árabe, they published translations of Nasser's position on agrarian reform And then in that work, she says that Brazilian modernist Jorge Amado also articulated notions of South-South solidarity that included Egypt and the new African nations. And so as Brazilianist journalist José Neiva Moreira stated, Nasser's popularity was so outgrown in Latin America that las cosas evolucionaron hasta llegar a la exageración de ver Nasserismo en todos, or things evolved to the point of exaggeration in seeing Nasserism in everything. Finally, the summer after the Cuban Revolution had triumphed, Fidel Castro sent his right-hand man Ernesto Che Guevara to Egypt, as we know, to seek inclusion into whatever kind of membership that Nasser was concocting for the Third World. Right? Guevara's visit resulted in Cuba renewing its request for Egypt to send a delegation in October 1959, reported here actually in the New York Times, and then it did so. It sent a delegation in March of 1960. That year, a new anti-imperialist energy was pumped into the non-aligned movement without precedent, and that was during the UN General Assembly in New York City when the Third World Fab Five of Tito, Nehru, Nasser, Sukarno, and Nkrumah met in front of a crowd of 3,000 people. Nasser also, of course, met with the exuberant, if not somewhat obnoxious, Fidel Castro. And I just love this photo because Nasser looks borderline embarrassed by, like, you know, Che Guevara's like sort of grandstanding this, and you know, he's more reserved. But it's a photo that I get stuck on because I'm like just thinking, what must have this like strategic man been thinking? You know, it's really mind-boggling to me. So the media's reaction to this scene was surreal. The expectation that the Arab world's most famous revolutionary would meet the enfant terrible of Latin America just electrified the masses, as Simon Paul has written in 10 Days in Harlem. Taking advantage from his captive audience, Nasser would make an unprecedented Latin African speech on the UN stage. So Nasser announced to the world that the glorious free advances in Africa, the glorious free advances in Africa, Asia, and Latin America became one under the banner of the non-aligned Third World. And here Nasser expressed a heartfelt welcome to Latin American nations, but also famously that the two peoples that went through similar experiences, that the Egyptian Arabs and Cubans were two people that went through similar experiences, emphasizing here the word similar. So after this excitement in 1961, the non-aligned movement invited Mexico, but also Venezuela, Brazil, and of course Cuba, to its conference hosted in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. And in 1964, at the non-aligned conference in Cairo, Nasser doubled down on his Latin American inclusion. In his closing remarks, he stated, I direct special reference to Latin America, whose participation with us has expanded in this conference. Confident that this continent, which is now full of great revolutionary possibilities, has stepped out from across the oceans to participate positively in building the world of tomorrow. So, can't overemphasize the excitement of what this period was. I often get nostalgic, especially going around sort of in Cairo, the 1960s buildings, of the nostalgia of what could have been. If only we had heeded sort of the strategies that I will relay at the very end of this talk that we find in the Mexican archive for me. But this Latin African Union would later be characterized as one that was equated with the macho figures like Castro. Neiva Moreira, again, a Brazilian journalist and intellectual, notes that Nasserism was even identified with Caudillismo, so strongmanness, in the figures of Che, and as late Jean Franco states, these masculinist oppositional politics that heroes like Guevara perpetuated subsumed the Third World under their guerrilla death. And Franco then regretted that Latin American writing was thus trapped, literature that is, was trapped within this negative eros that values the violent confrontation with death over community and life. Worse was that the Cuban Revolution, rather than being perceived as distinct from Nasserism, actually absorbed Nasserism into the Cuban internationalist fold. That is, that non-alignment became Cuban, and thus a universal model for Third World Revolution that, as I explained in the second chapter, Octavio Paz actively rejected. He actually defended Nasserism's particularity, how particular he was, how he refused to be absorbed into the fold of, say, universal communism or universal Marxism, etc. Or universal leftisms. He sort of had this, again, this leftism, this liminal leftism. So much so does Nasserism get sort of brought into the Cuban internationalist fold that the frenzy for Cuban internationalism leads to the very neoliberal New York Times to characterize Castro as the Caribbean Nasser. This absorption of Nasser into the Cuban internationalist project is ironic, mainly because it disregards how it was Nasser that mentored its representative revolutionary Che Guevara. And so during Guevara's visit to Cairo, right after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, Guevara stated that, quote, Nasser was a source of moral strength for them and willed, and this is Hegel, and willed to study Egypt's methods of land reform. But as Tahia Nasser has pointed out, Nasser attempted to temper this Cuban internationalism. Nasser attempted to dissuade Che from exporting his revolution to the Congo through his concept of solidarity and difference. And so in 1965, after touring various African nation states, Guevara asked for Nasser's blessing to go to the Congo. And while there's no record to my knowledge that just transcribes this meeting as it happened between Nasser and Che, Nasser's right-hand man, Mohamed Hassanein Hikal, remembers it in the following way. He says, "You must forget all about this idea of going to the Congo. It won't succeed. You will be easily detected being a white man. I believe the revolution is a worldwide phenomenon which makes no distinction between different colors and races, but there are certain things that must be taken into consideration. What we should do is help the Africans, try to give each people the right to do what it feels is correct. I disagree with the dogmatic Marxist view that a revolution can only start where there is a developed proletariat. Both Lenin and Mao have proved that thesis incorrect. But there must be at least a nucleus of petite bourgeoisie and workers. You must also have an infrastructure of communication. Ideas need communication just as the economy does. You cannot have a mass revolution unless there's a basic infrastructure." I was also reading before preparing for this. I was reading, and oh my gosh, I just blanked out reading. I was reading about the biography and Alexander. Thank you. In which she was discussing how Nasser was such a grand rhetorician, but most of the transcriptions of his rhetoric, of his speeches, have actually been diluted. And so when you have the transcriptions, we don't get as much of the passion that were part of his rhetoric, because they weren't translated, faithfully, if you will. So I can imagine that this conversation here was a lot more passionate than the transcription leads to. But also, what comes to mind in this conversation is that Nasser is basically very politely telling Guevara that he lacks an African critical knowledge, right? He's rejecting the universal dogmas of Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism, and explaining to Che that the Congo did not have a sufficiently strong petite bourgeoisie, nor an infrastructure that would enable its successful revolution, right? He's like, you have to study the case of the place in order to affect it positively. Second, Nasser brought to light the difficulties of South-South solidarity when it comes to race distinctions. Nasser here is pushing against the romanticization of, quote, a colored peoples united against imperialism motto that was a common feature of Cuban internationalism. And as Anne Garland Mailer explains, the rhetoric did not necessarily refer to one's own race or to one's own skin color, but rather drew from deep alignment with global anti-imperialist politics. So here Che was using this rhetoric to attempt a colorblindness that Nasser was breaking away from. He focused instead on the impracticality of being identified as a white Latin American in Black Africa, and how that would be bad for the Congo, and that Congo should not be an experiment taken lightly. Often, what might seem like benign solidarity from Latin America or Africa has actually looked a lot like Guevara, a disregard for the conditions of one's ally. As I mentioned in my past work, Garcia Marquez and Castro behaved similarly in Angola, even slipping into racist stereotypes, despite the fact that their writings were supposed to promote solidarity. This blindness towards a kind of Orientalism is difficult to assess, since Orientalism as a theory has usually addressed the directional West to East formula. And again, as Tahia Nasser has stated, this Latin American projection, quote, offers forms of South-South Orientalism that do not fit with Edward Said's Orientalism. For Or indeed, a blindness to one's own Orientalism might be based from the belief that one's membership to the Global South renders them immune from Orientalization. While one can justify Guevara's actions as proof of an anxiety of one's Latin American cultural identity as a post-colonial subject, and Waid Hassan has read Brazilians' racist attitudes towards Moroccans in his work, I'd like to suggest that Guevara's slippages are born from a much larger issue, which is, of course, the rejection of solidarity and difference. When the Congo experiment did indeed fail, Che Guevara refused to admit that Nasser had told him so. He instead denied any fault of his own, blaming others in his posthumous Pasajes de la Guerra Revolucionaria Congo. Here, without acknowledging Nasser's warning, the Argentine stated forlornly that, quote, Africa had a long way to go before it achieved real revolutionary maturity. The guerrilleros' patronizing ethnography of war, far from hailing the Latin African solidarity that Nasser championed, also devolved into paternalistic Orientalism. So, for instance, Guevara notes that his army had a tribal character that did not spare derogatory descriptions like calling Congolese superiors or jefecitos, calling Congolese superiors jefecitos, or like little bosses, or caciques disfrazados, which means caciques in disguise, describing their agricultural instruments as primitive and underscoring the superiority of the Cubans vis-a-vis the insignificant evolution in Africa in general and Congolese superstitions in particular. Later, Garcia Marquez's anti-colonial essays, the very ones that I've worked on Angola also doubled down on the primitive, terming Angolan beliefs atavistic and convenient and ultimately magical, absurd, or at least idiosyncratic. In the critiques waged in Guevara and Garcia Marquez, they behoove the African to be Latin American, ensconced as they are in the rhetoric of sameness from Third World Revolution. While it has long been acknowledged that Guevara substituted Western imperialism for his own in the Congo, what is less accounted for is that Nasser sought to disabuse Che of his ironic error. Guevara's Orientalizations made their way into Fidel Castro's gestures too, albeit in a more playful way. I should have put a slide in that box that we found the other day in the museum. I'll talk about this. But anyways, so the Orientalizations made its way into Fidel Castro's meeting with Nasser in a more playful way, because when they met at the UN Assembly in New York, Nasser received this gift from Fidel Castro, a box. It was a box lined with crocodile skin that looked like the Cuban cigars box, but it didn't have any Cuban cigars in it. And so then when Nasser was disappointed, he was like, where are my Cuban cigars? Excuse me. I'm just so certainly getting sick, I'm sure. Sorry for spreading the germs. But he said something to the effect of, oh, I didn't know that the premier smoked, but I will certainly like amend my error and send you some Cuban cigars later. And then he says, but I think I shouldn't have. This was an inappropriate gift because of course it's a box lined with crocodile skin. And of course you have a lot of crocodiles in Egypt, don't you? And to which Nasser responded, we have exactly 4. And then of course Castro was like, what? How do you? And he's like, they're all in the zoo, you know. And so this is a really playful moment, but it shows how Nasser is trying to disabuse Castro of this mythical, like the crocodiles of the Nile thing, you know. Where if now we were, in the Nile, and we were like, no, you can swim in there. There's no crocodiles. Don't worry. You know, it's the sort of this mythical Nile Orientalization, if you will, that is like in full display even when you visit as a tourist. But this is what Nasser was trying to disabuse in somebody like Castro. So whereas the Latin American Orientalism was outside of Said's purview, Latin American varieties of bias towards an exotization of the Middle East or North Africa have tended to be qualified as promoting a racial superiority, to paraphrase from Taia. And even when race is not always a critical paradigm at play in these slippages, they need to be assessed from the socialist strains of thought from which they emanate. From uncharitable cultural judgments to humorous pleasantries, this Latin American commentary on North African forms, this commentary on North Africa forms what Cristina Civantos terms a criollo Orientalism, thus revealing the limits of Cuban internationalism in the face of Nasser's possibilities. So in other words, Castro's Orientalism is not only a marker of his lacking critical insight of Africa, but a product of assuming third world similarity instead of Nasser's similarity and difference. So this is the less happier part. So was the Congress of Cultural Freedom, or CCF, which had its tentacles reaching the far corners of the global south. And the CCF, for those of you who are unfamiliar, was this major organization that had employed spies and poured money into art festivals and literary debates and the like, in order to bring into to sort of like buy the hearts and minds of intellectuals and bring them into their liberalist camp at the time of communism. So their ethos was to mold social liberalism in the image of the West. And in so doing, they released a sort of a plethora of Orientalist and racist caricatures like the one that you see here, but it was also in this journal, Cuadernos, in which much of the disparaging of Nasser took place. And I'll spare you the details of what I read. But yeah, so this was these were some of the archives that I looked at, and most of them are held at the Holborn Special Collections at the University of Chicago. Gives you quite a headache. It's quite despicable, but all of the sort of the anti-communist discussions are, and of course the Nasser too, are found here. And the reason I'm interested in the CCF specifically is because Cuadernos was actually founded in Mexico City. Cuadernos would be distributing and disparaging its racist imagery since 1952, presenting itself as an authority of Latin American intellectuals on matters of Third World Revolution. And in this way, it could say what it wanted to about Nasser because it was supposedly the authority. So I'll spare you the details, like I said, but they mentioned things like that Nasser was like this puppet, or had an aggressive expansionist agenda, or complots. And sadly, these comments would stick in a Mexican intellectual that I actually found out about while I was in Paris, Jorge Castañeda, who was the son of the second ambassador to Egypt, who, and if you read Castañeda Sr., you find traces of his Nasserism, but when you read Junior, who actually lived in Cairo for the first few years of his life, for about 6 years, when he was from like 6 to 12, he actually has these wonderful memories of living in Cairo and talks about them in this memoir, if you're interested. At the very beginning, he talks about it. But he has some sort of disparaging things to say about Nasser as well. And so Amaras Bedros, he criticized that Nasser did not kick out the CIA spies, failed against Israel, not mentioning the Western aggression that impeded their success, for not having abolished colonial stereotypes decades later. Nasser is a family also. Also, basically everything that's bad was like Nasser's fault in the view of this sort of liberal conservative, actually. He was this right-hand person of President Vicente Fox, who was found to be one of our terrible presidents. I'm sorry, we have a terrible history of presidents in Mexico. But anyways, so despite the distortions of Nasserism by both Cuban internationalism and Western intervention as we're seeing play out here, Mexican diplomatic and essaystic sources tell a very different story. So one that interprets Nasserism perhaps the closest to how Nasser himself might have viewed his politics. So this in Carrillo's Apuntes y Testimonios, it has not been translated into any language that I know of. It exists only in Spanish, but it's a memoir that includes reminiscences of his time spent in Egypt, which he calls the hub for African decolonization. And in this memoir, Carrillo reveals that Nasser had handpicked him, requesting a, quote, militant of the revolution to the Mexican embassy. This because Nasser stated that it had been both Iran's and Mexico's nationalization of the oil companies that had sparked his Suez proclamation. But then Nasser elaborated, I carefully studied both cases and came to the conclusion that the Mexican president proceeded with greater vision. He's referring to Lázaro Cárdenas, who famously nationalized Pemex, our oil company, and in the 1930s, and to this day remains nationalized. So I had, he said, I had this very much in mind, he insisted, when I decided to nationalize the Suez Canal to achieve our full independence. So that was like, oh, Viva Mexico, this is great. You know. to find this. And indeed, Nasser achieved independence with Mexico in mind without sacrificing difference, as Carrillo explains. Nasser toed the line between supporting Third World revolutions while also noting that Third World revolutions could not apply a one solution to all framework. One of the ways in which this difference and similarity was expressed to Carrillo was when Nasser invited the Mexican ambassador to share the ways in which Mexico had combated similar problems of agrarian reform with African dignitaries. Carrillo stated, Nasser was determined to overcome the dramatic misery in which the great majority of his countrymen struggled, especially the peasants or felas, ancestrally exploited. He looked to Mexico to help ideate solutions. In Carrillo's words, this issue aroused special interest due to President Nasser's determination to combat the latifundismo, he says, that during the monarchy had plunged Egyptian peasants into dramatic misery. African leaders to whom Nasser had procured asylum soon surrounded Carrillo, lending him support. And he also says in his memoir that a lot of the public university system and a lot of the great reform, the agrarian reforms, were things that Nasser pushed. He sort of explains in the memoir how much he was loved by the people and how this is a model that actually Mexico should now embrace in return, because even if Lázaro Cárdenas' era is over, there still can be a return to this sort of kind of governance. So the flame of the South-South model did indeed spread. He says, for example, so while Carrillo is admiring Nasserism, he's also saying how he's inviting Mexico to take part in the discussions of African recolonization, which I find so key because what he was trying to do was promote this connection. So Carrillo comes into the fold with all these other African intellectuals. For example, he meets Ahmed Sékou Touré, who expresses his enthusiasm for establishing relations with the country that made the first social revolution in the contemporary world, which of course is Mexico, which he means is Mexico. Something similar happened in Ghana, as Carrillo notes. La prensa local le otorgó singular importancia a nuestra visita. No dejó de causarnos cierto asombro el lenguaje socializante de los diarios de la capital del país. Hubo para la delegación de México, país que había expropiado el petróleo de las empresas extranjeras, amables expresiones. He talks about sort of how well hosted they were, how well received they were, his delegation. Carrillo, more than any other Latin American ally at the time, noticed how Nasser used similar global South strategies to inspire original strategies in other countries. And because it was a difference in solidarity, he says, not even his bitter enemies could accuse Nasser of subordinating himself to extra national interests. For indeed, Nasser facilitated Carrillo's presence at the All-African People's Conference in Addis Ababa in 1960, so he could share the Mexican revolutionary experience. And this is actually when Mexico comes into the fold of the non-alignment. Mexico didn't officially join the non-alignment because it had so much pressure from the United States. But in archival documentation, you see how much these intellectuals and these diplomats wanted to be part of those discussions. So what Carrillo did is that he sort of unofficially had Mexico participate in these conversations. And he says, hablé con el presidente Nasser acerca de mi interés por concurrir como observador a este importante evento, siempre que fuese yo invitado oficialmente al mismo. Con gran simpatía acogió mi petición y me ofreció conseguir lo que le solicitaba. So during this gathering, Carrillo experienced, perhaps like never before, a kind of solidarity between African nations and Mexico beyond the norm despite difference. When Carrillo heard, for example, the chants of Mother Africa, he remarked that these reminded him of the hemispheric union that Simón Bolívar, which I know, I just saw we have a statue here in Cairo of Simón Bolívar, which I will put in another slide. I think it was 1970s. Right? Yeah, I looked it up immediately. Anyways, I also almost caused an accident because I was so excited when I saw it in the car. The guy's like, "You want to stop?" I'm like, "No, it's all right." But anyways, so it was an expression of similarity and difference, driving Carrillo's solidarity with African sovereignty. So after these remarks to his African audience, this is Carrillo at the conference, something extraordinary occurred. Sorry, I shouldn't have, there's so many of his that I should have, I should bursting into enthusiastic cheers and the cry of Mexico, Mexico, Mexico. And even Haile Selassie was joined the celebration, he says. These incredible moments of Latin African solidarity that Nasser orchestrated and encouraged speak to the ethos that was a successful difference in similarity. It was a model that, while wildly misunderstood on the right or the left, would nevertheless live on in one of the most notable Mexican writers of all time. Here I offer just a brief example before ending. Bas, and this is the subject of the second chapter, so kind of like hoping for a cliffhanger. If you're interested in Bas, certainly I'll talk about him in the second chapter. But it suffices to say here in Corriente Alterna that he's talking about Nasser as being quite distinct to the ways in which Sartre had talked about sort of communist universalism, and that is that there was a particularity to Nasser that found similarities with other third world countries, but was always focused on what might be different that cannot be applied elsewhere, because to apply it elsewhere is still a sign of imperialism, just in a different name. And this is exactly what Bas is talking about here in Corriente Alterna. And we know that Nasser was significant because then we find him not only in his diplomatic documents that look a lot like this, that are scattered all over Mexico, very hard to find, because Bas died without a will, and so now the Mexican state is all fighting for his documents. You can't find them really, some you don't have access to, some are in like libraries like at Yale, and other ones are in the Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores. But he also, Bas also talks about Nasser in El Laberinto de la Soledad in Spanish, not in English, because the translation has omitted the mention of Nasser. So all to say that this is tricky. Nasserism lives on in some of our greatest authors, like Angola lived on, for example, Cuban internationalism, Angola lived on in Garcia Marquez, but only in translations in some cases. Only when one is like dead set on finding these trails, because even the book that I mentioned before, Octavio Paz, mentions Nasser, was very hard to find and does not circulate. So all this to say that I think that Nasserism lives on in of course, our Nobel laureate, Bas, who was a complicated figure in and of himself, but he lives on, Nasserism lives on in this poet. He lives on also in other more contemporary authors like Carmen Bullosa's expressions of Egyptian autonomy in her novel, which I'm blanking on, Cleopatra Dismounts, actually. And so it's an expression that still survives in these intellectuals, and that really begins this whole era that I hope we can continue talking about. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for an inspiring lecture, Sarah. And some people have left because they have classes at 2,
Yeah,
but
sorry.
we have a Q&A. And
I got excited.
we're very excited. I mean, we could talk about this for ages. And I'm sure many people have many questions, so we begin. You have a question?
Yeah. Apart from these particular examples, right, in which the writer Castro invites Garcia Marquez to go to Angola, and Garcia Marquez writes about Peru, is invited to a conference, and then he writes. What is the stakes, or what are the other meanings that originate, as opposed to writers responding to the political events of the day, situating themselves within ideological currents that surround them?
Contemporary?
No, at these moments or later. So I'm trying to find a little bit, to understand a little bit what you're trying to do by telling the origin story of these third world solidarities and leading it back to the figure of Nasser, and then saying that Nasserism survives and so on and so on, as opposed to a different understanding or more varied understanding of where these ideological currents might come from, how people might position themselves, and you know what I mean?
Yes.
And then it's a kind of question that to me, it was raised by the way that you're telling that story.
Yeah, that's a good question. That actually allows me to give you more of an overview of the book itself. And so the book really opens with Nasser, and it traces his influence all the way to these writers that you see here on the screen, which are African writers that, unlike maybe some Latin American writers, have come back to question the ways in which revolution failed when cooperation had been so promising, cooperation with other global South partners like Latin America. And a lot of these novels, for example, I've been talking a lot with Sami Chak, who sets the novel Fin de Mexico in Mexico City and talks about sort of these failed relationships between Africa and Mexican intellectuals. Like there's no understanding, cultural understanding between one side and the other. In fact, there's a lot of race. For example, there's this intellectual, Togolese intellectual that goes to Mexico City, the Colegio de Mexico, to give a talk, and he has ethnic scarring. And so a Mexican comes over to him and says, with an array of swear words, like, did you get mauled by a lion? Obviously referencing the fauna of East Africa, for example, safaris or whatever, the king of the jungle. And those sort of like very sort of racist moments in Mexican society, for somebody like Sami Chak, speak to the ways in which South Solidarity has failed to teach critical knowledge of the other during this time of revolution that has not been sustained. And that was a model that in what I've been reading in the archive that Nasser was really trying to promote. He was trying to promote that understanding. Even with Nehru, back in 1956, he was trying to say to Nehru, we have these things in common, but we don't have this in common. And so how can we make our commonality strengthen our differences? That our differences strengthen our similarities, in order to sort of permit. But it was not a rhetoric that could stand at the time, because at that time, the third world rhetoric was, nations, poor worlds of the nation unite, or it was the third world was not a place, it was a project, as Vijay Prashad has famously said. And so because it was this project, it was sustained by this ideology of sameness. And Nasser was critical of that at a time in which you could be critical of that, because that would get you canceled, as we would say today. He was canceled, essentially. And so, and especially because of the ways in which he handled communism on the left, and then CIA spying on the right. Like he was sort of trying to sort of stay in the middle and promote that, but we didn't have a way of defining that at the time, and it was misunderstood. And I think that a lot of intellectuals were able to run with it, with the exception of some few that I'm just describing. And so, if Nasserism continues in somebody like, say, Bas, the book then goes on to talk about how, while there might not be connected, Nasserism actually is strangely similar to an ideology of a Mexican 1970s feminist that visits Kenya and has a meeting with Ngugi wa Thiong'o, another person that sought sameness and was sort of embracing third world sameness. And sort of the problems that arise when you confront somebody like that and say, look, African nationalism works to a certain extent, but let's be open to Latin American allies, and Ngugi was very resistant to that allyship. So I guess I'm very interested in these moments of missed opportunity. And these moments of missed opportunity, I think, are much easier, of course, to gauge from hindsight, right? And if we're able to understand them from hindsight, I think that we are able to then model a politics within the literatures that we're reading today, for example, these, that help us not only revive the lessons of the past that Nasser was showing us, but to better understand. Like, I don't see these novels as depressing or disappointing. I see them actually as opportunities to revive that Nasserism and say, these were the missed opportunities, and this is how we can move forward.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. It's okay, thank you. I'm a bachelor student, a senior actually right now. And I feel like my question is going to be a lot more simple than a lot of other people's, but it is a wonderful opportunity to be here. The omission of a lot of non-Western figures is attributed to many aspects, be it racism or just Western homogeny, etc., etc., etc. But when it comes in particular to African revolutionary movements outside of the scope of Egypt or outside of the scope of North Africa, it becomes even more cast aside or overshadowed, and especially when we're talking about Nasser and his relations with him to Latin America and just Latinx revolutionary movements, he has, on many records, identified himself solely with Pan-Arabism. In fact, he was one of the sole creators, rather than aligning with already pre-existing Pan-Africanism, which in itself is a fascinating paradox because of racism against Egypt in itself, but that is not my point at all. When you are a revolutionary within the context of Nasser, how has it like come out? How would I phrase it? Yeah, it's very just fascinating. I would just like to know what you think. Like Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, all of these very, very, very important revolutionaries, and then Nasser just not. I'm sure he talked to them. He's had wonderful conversations with them, but he just hasn't connected with them. And you said it multiple times, missed opportunities, and I think that's really important. And I'd like to know
With African revolutionaries?
Yes.
Yes. Well, and I mean, I learned that, so I had this wonderful visit to Nasser's former home with Tahia, where it was just such a treat, such a delight to go to visit with her. And there I learned that Patrice Lumumba's children were raised in Cairo, which I didn't know. And the fact that I'm a scholar of the Cold War, I didn't know that, that took me coming to this space to learn, because of course we see the pictures, right, of some of those, of the children. And then of course being in conversation with Tahia is I think part of the problem that we don't, that yes, I think that very much he is conceived in general in Cold War studies, is conceived as this Pan-Arabist, and the Pan-African part is sort of like overlooked, I suppose you could say. I think that effort actually goes to somebody like maybe Nkrumah or Lumumba or later Cabral, right? Sort of like the bearers of the Pan-African movement, when Nasser was again at the very beginning of that. I mean, like Bas said, he was the face of the African revolutionary movement, and all of them came to when they were in trouble, when they had to flee, when they had to be in exile, they came to Egypt, and that I knew. I knew that sort of Cairo had become sort of this hub for revolutionary exiles, but it also became a place, like as Che Guevara mentioned, like a place where you came to learn and to strategize, and then I think that the eros of Guevarismo got to such a fevered pitch that it went out of control, and then of course he died, so that made him in 1967 he was a martyr. He died, he was assassinated in Bolivia, so I think that cemented his, as it should. I mean, he was a revolutionary. He said, he was a revolutionary of love in the end too. But the masculinist way in which he was characterized, I think, to the detriment of these models of solidarity that Nasser championed, made it such that Nasser didn't go down in history as much as sort of the leader of the Pan-African movement, the leader of the Latin African movement. He was at the very origin of that, and it is baffling how much is not mentioned in Latin American studies. It is. What I just described as him as the origin, it's really not an original idea. I mean, it's been there all along. And I think in part the problem is that we find it in scattered archives, and some of those documents are not translated. Again, it's a problem of translation that comparatists can fix. That you comparatists can fix. You're our hope. You're our future.
Thank you. Anna, I'm done. I have to go. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm very restless and scattered. I should start by saying
It
this.
should be restless and scattered.
Okay, well, first of all, I'm indebted to Tahia and to my friend Malak, who had to leave because of the class, that they told me about this book. And I'm indebted to you for creating this restlessness inside me. I'm a political economist. And political economist.
Okay.
And for the past 15 years or so, I've been giving 2 courses on Nasser, Egypt under Nasser, and something else, living with Nasser, one depending on moral history, the other on a political economy approach. But I'm also
73 years old. I was born in 1952. So I lived the Nasserite experiment virtually from its beginning. I still recall shots from 1956, when I was only 4, and I lived through the era of the ascent of national liberation and all the stuff. I've stood in the streets waiting for Nasser's car to move ahead, and so
I saw it. It's very excited to see the car.
The car? Yeah.
She saw it.
I don't know, but I was talking about going in celebrations, going that. So I have, in many ways, I am not quite a son of, but I'm definitely someone whose conscience has been built during this era. And I do consider myself a strong sympathizer with the Nasserite experiment, but I never felt that I can use the expression Nasserism. Okay? From a political economy perspective, at least. One thing that made me restless is while I was listening to you at the very beginning, I started wondering whether political economy is an inadequate perspective on its own to relate to the Nasserite experiment or experience. Okay? And I'm serious about this to the extent that I'm now revising in my mind the title of the course on Nasser I will give next semester. And I think I will change it and it will carry Nasserism in it. The balance tilted here because while a political economist mind wouldn't relate to some of the things you described here, the conscience of a person who lived it, who lived through it, it resonates very strongly. And I think this is one aspect of the Nasserite experience which is very intangible. In political economy terms, there are tangible things that you can observe. But what we've been talking about here, it's rather intangible, but it remains over time. To the point that I have no doubt that Nasser will be remembered in very different ways than my generation can communicate now. So I'm grateful to you. It's a reflection. I don't have a question. And I felt only, I regretted the fact that I do not have any Spanish. I would have very much liked.
I regret I don't have Arabic.
Arabic is easier to learn. No, but I mean, it's too old now for me too late to learn a new language, I guess. Thank you.
No, thank you.
I hope the talk is recorded and will be accessible.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Amazing. Thank you. Abdelhamid had a question.
You said something that actually resonated with us like yesterday. I'm the head of the African Heritage Association at UC. And by the way, we have an event on the 3rd of May, so it's my chance to invite you all to be Mu'tazila. And we had a discussion actually, like a couple of discussions on the issue of race and identity. In Egypt, as you said, there's a big discussion on are Egyptians Arabs? But there's also a discussion on are Egyptians African? Are Egyptians African? So there's the big discussion on race that comes into how we politically shape our identity. And I think in Latin America, there's also such discussions because of multiracial continent. But also you would see some countries like Chile, Argentina, where the issue of race, discussions of race will be a little bit different, if not more than a little bit, like than the Caribbean, for example. So there's some Latin American countries could identify with Africa because they have substantial community of people coming in from Africa through colonialism. So do you see that this kind of played part in having some discussion? That's my first question. My second question would be on the issue of the military, because we have seen at least in Latin America where there have been military regimes that have been supported by the CIA to crush the socialist movement. I think there was something called Project Condor, I think, yeah, which had created so much atrocities. So Gamal Nasser is coming from a military background. So in that sense, is there an aspect of discussion on Nasserism on how a certain military shows the pathway of socialism, while there are other military regimes within Latin America that shows the path of capitalism? And in that case, the issue is how a military as an anchor point in local politics could choose an economic system, and that would affect how both continents will see each other.
Those are great questions. It's great that we have a political economist here to help answer that second part of the question. My view is that he was very much tried to ideate positions that were not communist, that were not capitalist, that were something in between. And it was a sort of a creation of his own that gave him so much power. And in Latin America, at least in Latin America, that's why he was, I think, part of the reason why he was so popular, because you could ally yourselves with capitalism and sort of ask for aid here and there without being, considered as, going where the wind blows. It was sort of like it was strategic, but he remained firm on his convictions to socialism, and to making sure that poverty would drop. I actually see him very much similar to Claudia Sheinbaum today in Mexico City. I find her politics very closely aligned to his, and it's the reason why she has like a 70% popularity percentage. It's incredible. It's unprecedented. And I think it was, and her politics, when I read about it, I'm not a political scientist. I should have said this from the beginning. I'm strictly interested in the ways in which these ideals of solidarity bleed into literature later on. But from my view, Nasser was very strategic in being able to find out how he could lift the fellahin out of poverty, the fellahin that were immortalized in Frantz Fanon, right? That were sort of the pinnacle of Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, right? How he could bring those people out of poverty. And it all began with thinking about the fellahin. In fact, you could even argue that Frantz Fanon is sort of thinking back to Nasser too. That's not my project, but I think it's an interesting project to take on. For the military part, that's what's so fascinating also about Nasser, is that he was a military man, and yet he was the complete opposite of the military people funded by the CIA that were authoritarian, right? Like part of the authoritarian regime. And he was able to sort of disavow himself from the sort of the military part of himself to become this great rhetorician that was funny and that was like, I laugh. I don't speak Arabic again, but when I find his speeches that are translated, I giggle. I make this little giggle. Like, he's just such a funny guy, and so charismatic, right? And it gives you these pangs of nostalgia for those figureheads that, they're figureheads. They're not gods. They're not all powerful, right? And so there's Nasser, and there's like his governance, and then there's the people that surround him. And I was just actually thinking the other day by walking with Tahia in his house, if I was in the position of being a president, a job I would never want at all, and nowhere closer to that. Even dean, no way, nowhere close. Even chair of a department, nowhere close. It's just like you wonder who you can trust. Like if you think, who could I trust? I could maybe trust my sister. I could maybe trust my children. Who else? But you need like copies of sisters and children you can trust because that's what it takes. You need sort of an army to be able to oversee all these different dimensions of governance, right? And the bad rap that he gets in the Congress of Cultural Freedom is precisely all the criticism on his governance, the people that were in his government, and not necessarily on him. But yet they blame Nasser, right? So I think it's easy to. I mean, that's how presidents work, right? We have this figurehead, and that's why in the United States more people vote for a president than they do for the special elections, like for the what do you call it, the Senate races, etc. Right? Because that's the person that we see the most. I digress, but all that to say is that his military. I think that's also part of his strategy, was that he came to power through the free officers, right? Obviously his military identity, but he was also able to. It's almost like he was part of different dimensions all at once, like an alip. And I don't know how anybody could do that. There's very few, and I think that's why he was so inspiring to so many literary figures in Latin America. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think we can have, okay, so one last question. Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Quesada. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm in the Arabic literature department here. I'm a master's student and I'm a comparatist with Chinese and Arabic literature. And I really wanted to push forward, and maybe this conversation is slightly parallel to your talk, but you spoke a lot about South-South Orientalisms. And what I see from the text you're working with is this idea that Latin American leaders and political intellectuals are trying to see how Egypt and Nasser are influenced by Latin America, but when they come, they see, this is not actually as developed as the systems that we have. And the ideas, racist caricatures emerge and develop on top of this lack of revolutionary development that they discover. And I'm curious to think, how is this South-South Orientalism from the Latin American view different in the case of what they find in Egypt or East Africa compared to what they find when they come to East Asia or to somewhere like Vietnam? I've seen the Ikaik films about Vietnam and the idea we need to make Vietnams in Latin America everywhere. Was there a similar moment when Latin Americans arrived to Asia? Do they find it's not actually the radical revolution that we thought? Like, are there moments of disillusionment again, or is there a different kind of Orientalism that happens in Africa as opposed to Asia?
I'm thinking about it, because I think that the right person to answer that question would be somebody like Brian Cantor, who works specifically with Asian and Latin American comparisons. I mean, those are precisely the questions I think that we should be asking. I don't think I'm prepared to answer that, because I'm not as trained in Asian studies, and I wouldn't pretend to be. But I do think that those are precisely the questions, like, how are they different? I think that's a really important question. How are they different, and why are they different? If we find that they're, for example, they're certainly different. Go back to the original question of the gentleman that just left. There's these differences, and I just realized I didn't answer that part of the question. There's these differences between Arab racism and African racism, right? And then we find those discussions here, I suppose, in Egypt that comes up, the differences of identity of being an Arab Egyptian and being a Black Egyptian, right? And I saw that play out when I was in Aswan among the Nubian community, right? I would only caution that we don't sort of create sort of a hierarchy of pain, like which one is more racist than the other, because in the end they're all wrong, right? All these forms of Orientalism are wrong. I think that what these writers that I'm looking at, Nasser, Bass, are trying to sort of push is, and Nasser proposed this often, he said, a careful study of these different places that doesn't look like tourism, that actually looks like solidarity. So when you are visiting another country, it doesn't suffice to say, read Lonely Planet as a guide, but to actually be genuinely curious about how the other might live. So that when you are traveling there, you're not imposing your view, like Che Guevara was doing. Che Guevara was this great revolutionary, that you could argue was driven by love for the downtrodden, right, for the subaltern. But again, it was missed opportunity. That whole love was for naught because he refused to understand their position. And that's exactly what Nasser was trying to explain to him in a very diplomatic way. Like, you have to understand the Congo. You have to understand, like, is it not Orientalism or generalization when you are imposing your Latin American views of Cuban revolution onto the Congolese? Is that not Oriental? Is it not Orientalism to call their superiors caciques, lídercitos, jefecitos, whatever? And so I'm sure that that's played out on the Vietnamese plane as well. There were probably issues like that, and Garcia Marquez writes on that actually. I haven't looked closely to see what he said about the Vietnamese, but he said, if you're interested, the title was Estados Unidos, el país que destruyó a Vietnam, or something like that. It hasn't been translated, but it's in Notas de Prensa or Por la Libre. Those are his two sort of books of chronicles of war. And essays, like a collection of essays. But certainly there's a lot of what I call sort of slippages, and they of course are going to look different. But in the end, it comes from that, what Nasser said is this place of unstudiousness towards another global South partner.
Okay, thank you so much for a brilliant